Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Yes, welcome to the Oxford Centre for Life Writing and for today's first event of term. So my name's Illyri and I'm the events manager here at OCLU. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with OCLU, we are a research cluster based here at Wolfson College, and we're dedicated to exploring and supporting diverse forms of life writing. This afternoon's event is the first Writing Jewish Women's Life seminar of the academic year. And it's part of a programme that invites brilliant writers, scholars, performers and activists to explore and research Jewish women's voices as a vital part of our shared social and cultural history. Now, as well as our second seminar, which will be on radical women of the Jewish East End with Professor Nadia Valman and Dr. Vivi Lass, which is taking place in 7th week, so note for your diaries. OCLU has a wealth of book launches, workshops, writing groups, and talks coming up this term. So please do take one of the flyers, explore all the opportunities that are available to you here at OCLU, and do come and join us and our wonderful and vibrant community. So to turn to today's guest speaker, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Dana Mills. Dana is a dedicated writer, activist, and dancer whose work interrogates themes of dissent and Jewish identity. She is a dedicated advocate for the rights of Palestinians and currently writes and fundraises for Local Call and Plus 972 magazine, an independent online non-profit magazine run by Palestinian and Israeli journalists. Dana holds a DPhil in politics from Oxford and has published extensively on the radical lives and works of Jewish women, notably in her acclaimed biography of Rosa Luxemburg. Her latest book, One Woman's War, which was published earlier this year, draws upon her experiences of living in Tel Aviv in the months following the October 7th to bring a personal and a critical lens to questions of war, militarism, colonialism, imperialism, dissent, and Jewishness. In the spirit of her vital work, today Dr. Mills will examine the relationship between Jewish women's life writing and the imperative to write about and against war, colonialism, and imperialism. I met Dana 10 years ago this week, in fact, when Dana was the mentor for the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Masters here at Oxford. Over the past decade, I've seen Dana's stratospheric rise and development as an incredible writer and activist. I'm so delighted to welcome here to OCLU today to discuss an incredibly important and pressing topic for all of us. Testament to the relevancy of Dana's work, we're delighted to welcome one of the largest global audiences of attendees we've ever had, with participants tuning in from as far as India and New Zealand. So for all of you joining us online and here in person, I invite you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Dana Mills. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you so much to OCLU for having me today. It is typically special to come back here. I've attended many talks as a graduate student. And a very, very special thank you to Illyri Wolfson, who was my graduate student a decade ago, whose work taught me then and continues to teach me now. This talk asks questions about resistance to war and colonialism to life writing, and about the limits and possibilities of writing as resistance. The talk will span a time frame of about 10 years of different and intertwined life writing projects, with a spotlight on the past year, which has questioned or even changed my perceptions of war, writing, colonialism, and resistance. Through my own eyes and through the eyes of Rosa Luxemburg, with whom I have an ongoing relationship.
If you're speaking without the microphone, I worry that people online will not hear you.
I think if online might have a problem in terms of microphone and ceiling, but I can speak up if that.
Yeah, as long as
Online is fine, I believe. If anyone in the room is struggling. I'll speak up anyway. I'm happy to speak up. If you want to use the microphone on the left, then just press the button.
Oh, I give up. I'm not bothered with that.
I want to start with a clarification. I use the word war as a description for an existential or even a phenomenological condition. The actions of the Israeli state in Gaza, at the very least, are war crimes, maybe crimes against humanity, maybe genocide. I'm not entering the legal definitions here. There are people far better equipped to discuss that than me. But I want to illuminate a kind of continuity over the time in dealing with war as a condition, and especially with resistance to war. So I want to talk about continuity in resistance to war, especially continuity in women resisting to war, and especially continuity in Jewish women resisting war. As we meet here today, more than 42,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, many of whom are women, children, disabled and elderly who are unable to escape bombardment. The attacks have recently extended against civilians in Lebanon too. The conditions of power are not equal, so when I use the word war, I'm not entirely on the same playing field. I think and feel very deeply that we cannot fathom completely the horrors unfolding around us. For some of us, in our name, this paper and the projects discussed here are a beginning of an attempt to understand through writing or speaking the unheimlich, the uncanny. I'm going to start by reading a letter written by Rosa Luxemburg in 1914. It's on your handouts. It should be also available online. In the yard where I walk, military wagons often arrive, packed full with sacks or old uniforms and shirts, often spotted with blood. They are unloaded here, passed out in the cells, mended, then reloaded, and delivered to the military. The other day, such a wagon came drawn by water buffaloes rather than horses. This was the first time that I saw these animals up close. They are built sturdier and broader than our oxen, with flat heads, their horns bent flat, their skulls rather resembling the skulls of our own sheep. The buffaloes are completely black, with large soft eyes. They come from Romania. They are trophies of war. Anyway, a few days ago, a wagon loaded with sacks drove into a prison. The cargo was piled so high that the buffaloes could not make it over the threshold of the gateway. The attending soldier, a brutal character, began to beat away at the animals with the heavy end of his whip so savagely that the overseer immediately called him to account. Don't you have pity for the animals? No one has pity for us people either, he answered with an evil laugh, and fell upon them even more forcefully. Finally, the animals started up and got over the hump, but one of them was bleeding. Sonichka. Buffalo hide is proverbial for its thickness and toughness, and it was lacerated. Then, during the unloading, the animals stood completely still, exhausted, and the one that was bleeding, all the while looked ahead with an expression on its black face and its soft black eyes like that of a weeping child. It is exactly the expression of a child who has been severely punished and who does not know why, what for, who does not know how to escape the torment and brutality. How far, how irretrievably lost, are the free, succulent green pastures of Romania. How different it was with the sun shining, the wind blowing. How different were the beautiful sounds of birds, the melodious calls of the shepherds. And here, the strange weird city, the fusty stable, the nauseating moldy hay mixed with putrid straw, the strange horrible people, and the blood running from the fresh wound. We both, Rosa added, stand here so powerless and spiritless, and are united only in pain, in powerlessness and in longing. A letter from Rosa Luxemburg to Sophie. On October 7, 2023, around 8 in the morning, I landed at Heathrow on a night flight from JFK. I turned on my cell phone grudgingly, jet-lagged and sleep-deprived. I was going to London to meet my mother for a joint holiday for the first time since we lost my well-born father 4 years previously. My phone delivered strange messages. the Tel Aviv municipality announced that public shelters were open. My neighbor from across the hall texted me to ask if I was still abroad. When I answered yes, she texted back, good. That started the longest year I can remember, one that is still stretching on. Things escalated quickly. I understood them slowly. I understood that Hamas had attacked the south of Israel, including my cousin's kibbutz again. I understood that they were dead and some taken hostage. Israel started to attack Gaza the following day and has continued relentlessly since. These events are, of course, not without context. Gaza has been under siege and de facto occupation, prevention of freedom of movement of people and goods for the past 18 years. The Israeli occupation of Palestine was deepening. In Gaza, in the West Bank, and towards Palestinian citizens of Israel, apartheid had become an undeniable fact of life. On the 12th of October, shortly after I returned to Tel Aviv from London, I decided to restart a blog I had been writing in the times of COVID. I posted on my social media, in light of everything, I will restart my blog. I noticed many familiar names signing up. After a while, unfamiliar. I wrote mostly about the events unfolding around me, and especially in my name. The shock of the events of October 7th was fairly swiftly replaced with the horrors of what was unfolding in front of my eyes in Gaza. For anyone who had followed what was occurring in Gaza in the past few decades, this was hardly surprising and yet horrifying. The number of dead continued to rise exponentially. The photos emerging were grotesque and contained phenomenological memory that bound me to events from the far past of my Jewish ancestors. Only this time, we were the perpetrators, not the victims. In March 2024, my fourth book was published, a collection of these blogs entitled One Woman War. Ross Bradshaw, editor and publisher of 5 Leaves Press in Nottingham, had been reading my blogs and thought they might be of interest as a collection. My friend and Standing Together activist Sally Abbott agreed to write the introduction. I vehemently dislike this book. It is a book drenched in grief, in horror, and in violence unraveling around me that I could not truly resist. This tension between the impulse for resistance and the inability to change actions around me is an underlying narrative of this paper and of many of my life writing projects. 3 years previously, I had left my life in academia to work in civil society in Israel-Palestine. I wanted to make a difference. I did not know what that meant. I still want to make a difference. I still do not know what that means. It had been strange to write a Jewish life seeking to resist colonialism and militarism, this time my own. I had known intimately the challenges and price paid for a life of resistance for approximately a decade I had spent in the close company of Rosa Luxemburg. My friend and inspiration, Rachel Holmes, whom I actually heard speaking here about her brilliant biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, Natural Born Rebel, out with Bloomsbury in 2020, says that one does not choose one's subjects. They knock on our backs, and we are moved to respond. My book on Rosa Luxemburg was a happy accident of a larger project. Hopefully, it will be my next project. A genealogy of radical Jewish women who dissent against the concept of a nation state, or maybe the state in and of itself, and resist the global constellation that arises out of it. The logic of this project was clear to me. Just as some women of color, queer women, or immigrant women did not just strive for more legal rights within the construct of the nation state for themselves, but rather understood its exclusionary nature, some Jewish women would have particular insights about the essential oppression of the nation state. The Jewish movement of Haskalah, the Jewish parallels for the Enlightenment, together with the impulse for more and more assimilation, especially for the middle classes, those who could pass for Gentiles, also generated some women, few and far between, who understood that centering the values of liberalism and rationalism together with newfound loyalty to nationalism would generate irresolvable tensions it would only lead to more and more exclusion and oppression. There were women who did not just seek liberation for themselves and those who came from their class and religion, but sought an overall more emancipatory project. Whether it was due to the internal tensions of liberalism, the impulse of nationalism, or the discordance between the two, these women, as I refer to them fondly in my Jewish essays, understood that their struggle was not only within the nation state, but also against it. Rosa Luxemburg was an obvious candidate for such a project. She was born in the Polish town of Zamość in 1871. The youngest child of a Polish Jewish family, she was thrice discriminated against. First, as a Pole living under the Russian Empire. Second, as a Jewess. Third, as a woman. From child, she developed a hip condition that caused her to walk with a limp and to be disabled her entire life. In her teen years, she joined the Proletariat Party, a revolutionary party which objected to Polish independence, as opposed to the prevalent view held by, at that time, Marx and Engels and Marx's youngest daughter, Eleanor, who was her comrade in the Second International. Rosa gained a PhD from the University of Zurich in 1897 in law, something that was very rare for women in her time, getting a PhD. Her thesis looked at the development of the economy of Poland. She became famous in 1898 in her response to Edward Bernstein, Engels' most famous student, when she resisted his theory of opportunism and assimilation of capitalism. And she wrote her very, very famous work, Reform or Revolution. Her canon also includes very diverse works such as editing work, including the translation and editing of Vladimir Korolenko's Life of My Contemporary. It's also literary works. And of course, she has a very rich canon of letters, one of which we just spoke to, and others we will return to. Those letters were largely written when she was imprisoned for various reasons, but mostly for resisting war. Her comrade in the Second International, in which she was active, Franz Mehring, called her the best brain after Marx. She was killed in 1919 by the Freikorps, who were a proto-fascist group working in collaboration with their own party, the SPD. That's something we know only recently that helped them along in their assassination, against the background of the failed German Revolution of 1918. When I started to write about Luxemburg, or Rosa, as I refer to her interchangeably in this talk and indeed in my mind, there were several elements that drew me to her. First, her work, The Accumulation of Capital, widely related as her most important work, was the first in-depth study connecting imperialism and capitalism, ensuring the inextricable link between the expansionist tendency of imperialism and of capitalism, and the geographical expansionism of the European nation state of her time. Luxemburg set forth a simple yet brilliant argument. Capitalism always needs new markets to expand into, and the state limits the possibilities of this expansion. Consequently, the capitalist nation state, or the European states that she was writing about, would constantly seek international markets, which would provide them with the necessary demand for their ever-increasing supply. The economic logic of her formulation was falsified very briefly after she wrote this piece, but the significance of exposing clandestine and sometimes presented as benign relationships between capitalist markets in Europe and geographical expansions outside of it had influenced the radical canon that followed her and left this relationship open for further discussion. The connection between colonialism and capitalism, as well as her influence on this possible ways to resist colonialism, resonated with me very deeply. Second, I found Luxemburg's work on the Polish question surprisingly timely. The question of whether granting independence to Poland would be the first step in bringing down the Russian Empire, reducing the centrality of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires, and indeed catalyzing the crumbling of capitalism, was one of the most urgent geopolitical questions of Luxemburg's time. She argued against Polish independence, and in that as an outlier of the great greats of her time, as I mentioned, Marx and Engels and many others. Luxemburg was certainly sensitive to the need for cultural belonging and communal life, elements that transpire in her personal correspondence as well as in her formal writing. But she opposed sovereignty of her own people point blank, whether she was still a fledgling thinker in the 19th century socialist movement or a famous or notorious leader in the Second International. As an Israeli who had been politically active since my teen years, I had been thinking of questions of sovereignty for a while. I wrote my default year at Oxford, and I called it Moving Beyond Boundaries. It's actually about dancing politics, not Jewish women's lives. And I remember having a conversation with an Oxonian colleague who said to me, of course you're obsessed with borders and boundaries. You're an Israeli. That's something that you care about a lot. So it's something that had been circling in my mind. There are curious resemblances between the Polish question, as it was known then, until Poland was granted independence in 1918, and the question of Palestinian sovereignty in our time. In Rosa's time, as in ours, the concept of the state is ubiquitous. To rephrase the recently departed Frederick Jameson, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the state. Or, as Luxemburg would argue, the end of capitalism is essentially intertwined with the end of the state. The Polish question was volatile and divisive in the 19th century and caused much debate and uproar within the International and outside of it. Whether I do not wish to claim that the ongoing suffering of the Palestinian people is in any way equal to the position of the Poles in Luxemburg's time, the centrality of this question in international discourse, as well as the logical constellation that ending the oppression of one people, or conversely granting sovereignty to another people, would change the balance of power in geopolitics beyond the parties directly involved, has noticeable parallels. Many Israelis are curious about the interest that apartheid and occupation in their midst generates internationally. The age-old accusations of anti-Semitism and pure naivety considering international solidarity gain a different perspective when compared to the centrality of the Polish question in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I set on to write about Rosa Luxemburg's life, curious by many aporias and ready to be surprised by some I didn't know. Writing a biography is like going on a blind date. You know basic elements about the person. You know enough that it makes you want to swipe right, if you like. But like any relationship, willing to meet in person is also willing to be surprised. There were some days I was angry at the choices Rosa had made. There were some days I wanted to offer her a hug. It was very clear to me that she had been dead and existed in a world to which I had no access. I do not hold a mystical view which makes her present when I write about her. But living in such an intense way with another human being, especially while delving into their archive, which always involves finding surprises, some welcome, some unwelcome, means being able and being open to the conversation to evolve as the world changes and as I change. The project of writing Rosa Luxemburg's life was always a political project. I had embarked on writing her life against the backdrop of the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, who had offered a socialist alternative challenging hegemonic blocs in two-party systems. Corbyn had galvanized the imagination of youth like no other leader had managed for decades. In 2017, I attended the Labour Party conference in which Corbyn stood on stage like a rock star in front of tens of thousands of young people. This movement had intellectual ripples. My young students were interested in reading Marx again. In an email to the Labour Party members in September 2019, then Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John McDonnell, quipped, "Socialism or barbarism," Luxemburg's statement from her 1950 pamphlet, The Unionist Broschüre. I was writing Luxemburg's life, thinking about the question whether it is possible for some of her ideas to be making a popular comeback. The question of nationalism, of course, was haunting my text too. After Brexit and discourse around immigration in the UK, as well as the US, were occupying the front pages of newspapers. Borders were reaffirmed and redrawn as rubber boats carrying immigrants were sinking in the Mediterranean. Fear of the unknown yet ever-present immigration becoming the shadowland of our political hinterlands, was pretty much everywhere. Luxemburg's view or vision of bringing down the current geopolitical system in which nationalism is the grounds for sovereignty could not feel more distant. Of course, in my other homeland of Israel, things were rapidly deteriorating. As a young activist, I had spent my 16th birthday protesting Benjamin Netanyahu. He is now marking nearly 30 years in power. Since 2015, when my journey with Luxembourg had commenced, Israel was turning overtly more and more to nationalism, fascism, and jingoism. Many of us will say that the seeds of what we see today, a rogue state, that Orientalism and racism guides its foreign and internal policies, were long sown. And that, indeed, the soft left and center had been sustaining this vision and facade of democracy for a long time. Currently, the new hope for the Zionist left, Yair Golan, was famous for pointing out, as chief of staff, that dark processes not unlike the ones that had unfolded in Germany in the 30s were taking over Israel, is now actively calling for bringing troops into Lebanon and occupying part of its land. There is little by way of resistance to the idea that Jews should have privileges in Israel-Palestine while continuously expanding geographically, and that war in and of itself is evil. The horrific escalation in the region this year, which is probably inevitable, had emotional tolls on all of us, including those of us who had been able to analyze the processes we were witnessing and for which our taxes were paid. The anger and despair against those in power abusing their status to galvanize hatred and division were intense. Since the 7th of October, this anger, hopelessness, and feeling of futility were intermeshed in grief. Seeing more and more lives lost in what seems like a never-ending war, noticing that fear and despair felt by my colleagues, especially my Palestinian colleagues, who are unable to grieve for their families and loved ones in a country that deems them the enemy, had been a lesson in the many limits of resistance to war, but also in the absolute necessity of cultivating spaces for such resistance. Against this backdrop, and after publishing my memoir, The 13 Months of the War, One Woman's War, I had begun translating my Rosa Luxemburg biography into Hebrew. At first, I started translating without a plan and without a clear ethos. I felt she resonated with the moment I was living, and my relationship with her gained a new meaning. I am steadfastly against anachronistic readings in historiography, including in life writing. Luxemburg was assassinated in 1919. We never inhabited the same world. The lessons we may draw from her works should always be read in her historical context. Yet some of them can travel to our time and raise warnings, signs, as well as teach us valuable lessons. There I was, a woman resisting war, writing about resistance to war, and translating the life of a woman who had resisted war and was writing about resistance to war. A question encircled in my mind as I embarked in translating and rewriting the biography for Hebrew readers. What is the point in writing in the world as I had seen it? Can an act of writing be part of activism, of actively trying to make the world more just and equal? I now return to the letter that Rosa Luxemburg sent her friend Sophie Liebknecht. Meanwhile, the prisoners bustled busily about the wagon, unloading the heavy sacks and carrying them into the building. The soldier, however, stuck both hands into his pockets, strode across the yard with great cries, smiled and softly whistled a popular song, and the whole glorious war passed in front of my eyes. The letter which I chose to share with you, the so-called Buffalo letter, had been canonized and pastiched, treated with reverence and ridicule. Austrian poet and journalist Karl Kraus was one of the first to single out the letter within Luxembourg's canon. He claims that the letter was not well known when he carried it around and read it in public, after he found it in the Viennese Arbeiterzeitung on the 23rd of May, 1920. He then reprinted it in the newspaper Die Fackel around the same time as the first volume of Luxembourg's letters published in German. Later, the letter was reprinted in a small volume entitled The Creature, the War, and the Future of Humankind, in which Kraus dedicated it to the noblest of victims. he juxtaposes the letter to a response from a reader of the Freckle, who says that indeed the letter is lyrical and beautiful, but Luxemburg is guilty of hysterics, and the letter is drenched in sentimentality and excitement. Later, this enraged letter was traced back to Ida von Lili-Rachten von Lillenbach, the wife of an Austrian local district officer. Krauss defends the letter, and what he needs is Luxemburg's humanism. He was not the only one in his generation. Walter Benjamin writes about this letter to his friend Gershom Scholem. Benjamin had been given Luxemburg's prison letters as a birthday present. In a letter from the 6th of May, 1934, Benjamin explicitly seconds Krauss's reading of the letter. At the time of writing to Scholem and reading this letter, he had been working on a lecture meant to be given in the Communist Institut de l'Étude de Fascism. Benjamin's letter explores political alternatives to counter evil, as well as discussions of lesser evil. To be fair to Krauss's correspondent, Luxemburg herself adds complexity to this famous letter. In a later letter she sent Liebknecht, she contemplates what is the use of looking through the buffalo's eyes and whether this depletes her of her energies unnecessarily. She was anything but a romantic daydreamer, and yet there was something in this crystallization of the moment of empathy between the creature and the woman. The total and complete resistance to violence in war, captured by Luxemburg in the moment of its appearance, and many others who had followed her and returned to the letter. Jumping ahead more than a century, I had reflected on the exchange between Krauss, Benjamin, and Lillenbach, and on Luxemburg's letter to Liebknecht, when on the morning of the 19th of September 2024, I had heard that 15 cows were killed as a result of a direct hit of a missile fired from Hezbollah towards the north of Israel. The death toll in Gaza was constantly rising, as was the death toll of civilians in Lebanon, both as a result of ongoing Israeli attacks. And yet, at that very moment, the letter resonated with me strongly. I understood Luxemburg's writing, and like her, felt that the whole glorious war passed in front of my eyes. What is the point of writing and translating in the face of war? What may this moment of staring into the buffalo's eyes teach or signify for us today? Reflecting on the past year and beyond it, and of my relationship to Rosa Luxemburg, I would like to conclude this talk with offering a conceptual distinction to perhaps illuminate, if not resolve, the question of the relationship between writing and resistance of war against war of colonialism. In my Hebrew edition of Rosa Luxemburg biography, I propose the distinction between what I term internal and external resistance. Internal resistance is an act aimed to resist evil encapsulated in the world, for instance, during war, without the aim of that act to ripple in the world or to have societal effects. This is not merely a thought or a reflection, but it may not flesh out completely as an act of civil disobedience. The photo that I've chosen to accompany my talk is of a tree planted in the prison yard by Rosa Luxemburg. I read that too as an act of internal resistance. It's intervening and bringing nature and beauty and vibrance into a sphere of incarceration and limit and freedom. Looking into the eyes of the buffalo, or indeed trying to protect them from the soldier, or even reporting on this incident to Sonia Liebknecht, are two acts of internal resistance. These are not moments of galvanizing the masses and trying to sweep them along, nor are they moments of civil disobedience. There are ample of those in Luxemburg's canon, of course, as well. But I argue here that in order to understand the whole scope of resistance to war, and where these possibilities can arise and can be cultivated, we must be attentive to these moments of internal resistance, which are moments of dissent, moments that intervene in landscape of violence. These perhaps can be read as an attempt, in the word of another Jewish woman whose life I am intimately writing, Hannah Arendt, to remain friends with ourselves. But these are acts that have some renunciation in the world, some artifact, be it a tree, a letter, an essay, or a book. Rereading Luxemburg's Buffalo letter and writing about and against the war myself became clear to me as acts of internal resistance. These are pleas to bring some humanity into the world, some compassion to the landscapes around us, some kindness towards both the human and non-human. They are quests for a world that we don't even know, and that it is impossible to imagine at this time. They are requests to heed to love rather than hate. They are requests to look the world in the eye, not look away, but to demand better. Especially when the possibilities for external resistance seem small or even impossible, internal resistance, those of us who refuse to be soldiers in never-ending wars, who insist on seeing people around us as people, not enemies, and to directly gaze into the face of evil enacted in our name, are presenting acts of internal resistance. The horrors enacted by my own people, using my tax money in Palestine, are unspeakable, and yet they must be documented and remembered. Perhaps paradoxically, and perhaps necessarily, spending a decade reflecting about writing, Jewish women's lives has pushed me to do what I can to resist. Writing about the war, writing against the war, is read here as part of the repertoire of acts of resistance. This distinction, and asking us to be attentive to those acts of internal resistance, perhaps so we can galvanize and unravel landscapes and imaginaries in which acts of external resistance can become possible, leads me back to where I started, in Israel, Palestine, 1 year after October 7th. In order to reflect on this moment, as well as offer some thoughts for the future and my own next projects, I turned to an interlocutor of both Benjamin and Sholem, who actually had reviewed Nettel's biography of Rosa Luxemburg on, note the date, October 6, 1966, in the New York Review of Books. Hannah Arendt wrote lines that resonate today, as they did in the year that she wrote them, 1943, in the essay, The Crisis of Zionism. The foundations of Zionism were laid when nobody could imagine any other solution of minority or nationality problems than the autonomous state with a homogeneous population. Zionists are afraid that the whole building might crack if they abandon their own ideas. The contrary is true. The building will collapse if we don't adapt our minds and our ideas to new facts and new developments. Arendt, as well as Sholem, supported Brit Shalom, a movement that campaigned for an autonomous political body in which both Jews and Palestinians would enjoy equal rights under the British mandate and would eventually be a binational state as part of a regional federation. Indeed, she warned that the choice would be between balkanization or federation in an essay from 1950 entitled Peace or Armistice in the Near East. This was hardly a well-liked view in that time, and it feels almost fictional as a vision these days. However, the initial impulse, which pushes to present an imaginary of a state beyond its ethnicity, of sovereignty that does not exclude and create rightless minority in its foundational moment, of building trust as part of a joint political project, are more necessary than ever. I have always felt that what seems most distant and most fictional is what is most urgent and lacking in our political hinterlands, and indeed imaginaries, equality, trust, and beyond all, an aspiration to live in peace. The project from which this whirlwind exploration has started, the attempt to imagine a world outside of the nation state through writing Jewish women's lives, is not only urgent but necessary. True, none of us think this can be implemented in one day, nor that can commence tomorrow. Presenting this vision does not take away from the severity of the crimes committed by Israel. But looking into the future, alongside accountability for all that has been done in the past, it feels clear to me that we must continue to fight for a world in which we are able to live together as equal beings, to have respect to our surroundings, and above all to each other. To face the past and what it is, and yet to believe that the future can and must be different. As Luxemburg wrote in another letter, the world is so beautiful with all its horrors, and it would be even more beautiful if there were no weaklings or cowards in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a wonderful talk.
We now have time for questions. Would you like to grab a seat? So yeah, I'm conscious you've been standing for a very long time.
It's okay, good for me to walk.
Okay, all right. So I'll let you field the questions.
Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Okay, so just I know just arrived in Oxford 5 years ago. I am somewhat familiar with Rosa Luxemburg's life, and I have read some works by Arendt. I noticed that although Arendt, I think, admired Rosa Luxemburg quite a bit, possibly under her mother's influence, she disagrees quite a lot with Rosa Luxemburg's socialist, universalist, internationalist project. So when you were talking about Rosa Luxemburg and how she was one of the radical Jewish women that rejected the nation state and looked for political belonging and political purpose beyond the nation state, informed by their own experience of alienation as Jews in the nation state framework of Europe. Hannah Arendt, on the contrary, believed in the necessity of a political community, and she was very skeptical, I think, in the origins of totalitarianism about the idea of universal human rights, sort of that apply to all people. She was saying that, those sound very nice, but they only sound very nice when you already belong to the political community, and you had that sort of positive liberty afforded by the political community. For example, the freedom of movement is a universal human right, but if you don't have a home, you're not a citizen, then you're basically a homeless person. You can go anywhere you want, but that does nothing for you. So I was wondering how I think you can see this as like, so both of them were Jews, Arendt and Luxemburg, but one of them took their, experience of alienation and non-belonging to the Gentile majority as precipitating, a break from the idea of the national political community and trying to see beyond that, an alternative to that. Whereas Arendt, experiencing the displacement and the exile of the Nazi regime in the Second World War, she was missing that as well, that community. But she said instead, oh, we need it. Like she had sort of the opposite reaction to Luxemburg. Like she wanted what she didn't have, where Luxemburg rejected what she didn't have. So I'm wondering, I see this done. I'm Chinese myself. I see this dynamic very often in today's minorities and today's immigrants. Some people really want to belong to the, white culture in vulgar terms, you can call it that. And they assimilate, they try to, take on all these characteristics and these traits of the dominant racial group. Whereas others, I think this reaction, the second reaction is kind of more common, especially after George Floyd. They totally reject white culture. They embrace their own particularity. They're not socialists, but today's dominant left paradigm is identity politics, and they believe wholeheartedly identity politics, and they don't want to seek any sort of reconciliation or communication with the dominant majority. They want to go their own way. So I'm very interested in what makes someone decide for one or the other, and are both legitimate responses, or which one do you think is? I don't know. I think it's a big thing to say this is the correct way. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Maggie, that's a wonderful question, and it's one of my main motivations in this project. We need to look at how different people respond to maybe similar tensions, maybe similar moments in historical times. I'll start by saying a few things about Arendt and Luxemburg, because you kind of set it out really beautifully, and I want to take that up, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Arendt's response and why she belongs in my two assessments project, although she's complicated and contradictory in her own right. So Arendt had a very complex relationship to Luxemburg. As you said, she was influenced by her mother, also by her husband, who was a Spartacist. She admired her. Actually, Luxemburg was the only woman she taught in her intellectual history courses. Interesting in its own right. she read her very thoroughly. I did some archive work both in Library of Congress and in Arendt's archive in Bard College. And she has really interesting notes on Luxemburg's work. She spent a lot of time reading her. And I would say I feel very strong affection to Arendt. I find her super interesting intellectually. She was a very, very terrible reader of Marx. Like that has to be said point blank. You know, the human condition contains misreadings that are hard to ignore, especially in the work and labor chapters where she reads Marx and you're kind of like, which Marx are you reading? Because I don't know that Marx. It's like maybe it's the other volume of Capital I didn't know they got to, but like Arendt reads things for her own use and reads them in the way that helps her. Fair enough, and like all well and good. So when she turns to Luxemburg, it is to take something very specific from her. She doesn't look at the entire project. She does read very thoroughly the accumulation of capital. She spends some time with it, but she's not interested in the political project, as you said. And I think, as I mentioned, with my own relationship to Luxemburg, Luxemburg is a product of her time. She died in 1990. She was killed in 1919. Arendt, likewise, is a product of her time. You know, she kind of lived in a time in which the nation state becomes ubiquitous in one way, but also becomes very volatile in another way. And I mean, here I jump to the second part of my response. The reason why Arendt is really interesting to me is her very early writings on Israel-Palestine, in which, again, not to say that she got everything right from me and that she's my inspiration, I'm taking her here and saying this is what we should do, but rather that she has really interesting insights into where a Jewish ethnic state can be headed. And I think there's something really interesting for me about Arendt's writing that is always a bit contradictory, but then she always kind of turns things on their head in an interesting way. I don't think she's very different to the way that I write, for instance, because I see myself as an activist. Illyria very generously introduced me. She never saw herself as an activist. She kind of said other people can do that. That's great. She admired some people who did that in a certain way. She never saw herself as that. She did take a very active role in helping Jews to escape during the Second World War. So I think there was a moment when she was like, this is something I really have to do, so I have to go and do it. Or like, I'll just sit and write notes about it and then theorize about it. But she never saw herself as an activist. And yet she has some interesting insights about where Jewish nationalism can be heading in a kind of sovereign formation. And so the quotes I took for this paper are taken from the Jewish writings, where she writes very much about Israel becoming a kind of Sparta. She talks about how the army will become too central in the country's people, so how it will take over culture and other forms of life. And in many essays, she talks about how the treatment of Palestinians is dangerous, not only for what Israel is doing to Palestinians, but for the Jews themselves. So I think here she's really interesting for me as a kind of even like a soothsayer, like looking into the future and saying, if you go that direction, it will not end well. The project I'm sort of thinking about, and again, it's a project that I started and deserted about 5 times, and now I'm like, no, I finally have to do it. It's like this part of this talk is to sit down and actually start doing it. Is to look at different responses to the nation state, none of whom offer a utopia. I should say also Luxemburg doesn't offer an alternative utopia. She doesn't sort of say, I understand completely how the world will look without nation states in it. In Second International, they very much didn't think about the day after the revolution. They were like, we need to gather mass for the revolution. Then 1917 happened first, then 1905 happened, then 1917 happened. And then they were like, okay, what do we do now? So there isn't kind of a plan in place of what we should do and how we fit into this, but there's interesting ways of criticizing the national project within the state formation that I find for our time. And for me, it's what I have to say again, this is a very personal project. As a Jewish woman living in Israel, Palestine, and looking at what's happening around me, that I find really very helpful. So I hope that answers a little bit of the tension. But I think my very short answer to what should be done, everyone should find their way. I don't think there's one way that is correct and like we should all sort of head that way. I think renouncing violence in and of itself is important. But in terms of nationality, etc., I think people find their way within this very complex formation.
Any further questions or comments?
kind of open it up a bit. It was such an extraordinary talk that I'm still trying to process it, trying to kind of find a way to step down, really, if you like, from what you were saying. I don't know other people as well, because there was so much in it, and I kind of want to go back to her letter, because it's the first time I've ever heard that, and I'm so glad that that's what you included, because I wonder what it's saying, and it sounds perhaps a naive question too, about the protagonists, because the soldier is protagonist, and I'm just, because I've just had something else been written, which is about here actually, and I've been editing it. There's someone who's been a long-term peacemaker in Northern Ireland, and it's one of the things he said. He starts with about, who are the peacemakers? They are the protagonists. Is there something in this letter about that?
Oh, like the first step towards peace, or the
I was just that, well, not the first step towards peace, because that sounds too functional. But and also I'm very interested in what you were saying about that relationship between, it's not just internal resistance, but also something prior to that, internal perception, awareness, reflection, but much more the very people who commit acts. This is actually what it's saying. The very people who commit acts are also the people who walk across the yard with their hands in their pockets and this was on. And that's said just because that's the way things are. It's kind of a really curious letter, and I'm not sure how to reflect on it really.
I mean, thank you. That's a really rich question. I have to think about it also. I think for me, one of the reasons I chose to start with this letter, I've been reading it in the legacy of Karl Kraus. I've been reading it in talks for I don't know how long. But then this moment of 15 cows killed in one go just completely changed how I read it. And I found it, and again, like I've had an intellectual relationship with this letter for at least 10 years. I started reading it when I started reading Luxemburg. And I think there's something interesting in what you said. I'll say something about Northern Ireland in a second, but those who commit violence are often those who are most staring at the face of violence. They know they don't refuse to acknowledge it. They don't look away. In a way, our biggest battle right now is with the ones who are looking away. And I think Luxemburg and the soldier, and now sort of thinking out loud about your question, they're both looking at the face of the thing. They're both looking at violence in itself, in the prison yards, and dealing with it in their own right. And it might be, and I take your point that it's too functional to think about what would be the next step, but thinking about peacemaking processes and thinking about examples from around the world, very often those who have been involved in combat are the ones that are easy to pin us. I take this and I digress slightly, but I'm sort of again thinking out loud because it's a really, really interesting question. In June this year, I went on a retreat with my colleagues and comrades for my day job, 972 Local Call, which I really encourage you to look at, when a group of Israeli and Palestinian journalists working on the ground and doing analysis of what's happening. And we went on a retreat to Northern Ireland, to a place called Colonialism, which has a very long legacy of peacemaking and also within the Irish context. And when we went over, we were very tired and very cynical, because we had been sort of working on this, especially my colleagues who are writing from the ground, I have to say, dealing with this for good, at that point, 8-9 months. And talking to people who were involved in the negotiations in Northern Ireland, especially we met journalists who had talked about the experience. It's something about once you're in the face of it, then in a way, flipping the perception is not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is first to get to the perception and then maybe to deal with it. And that was a really transformative week for us. And I don't think any of us expected it to be that important, that interesting. But just hearing from people who said, obviously, again, not to compare, everything is different, everything has its context. The troubles are not Israel-Palestine, and it's a different time. But some people stood and talked to us about things that they experienced, that we experienced. It's like, I had colleagues that were killed down the road and then I had to go and report about it. And some of my colleagues are dealing with this all the time. That you realize there's something about looking at things and sort of looking at them directly in the face. And for me, that is the first step for anything, for any transformation. And I think it's really ironic and interesting that at this moment, we're so flooded with information. I mean, neither in Luxembourg nor in Arendt's time did we have access to so much information as we have now. You can go online and you can see everything 24/7. You don't have to look even, it just spits you in the face, literally. And yet the impulse to look away is very strong. It's the human impulse to protect yourself. I'm not a Freudian, but we don't need to be in order to understand why people don't want to deal with it. But again, I think the contradiction between the availability of information and how people choose to engage with it is really striking. And I think, again, that's why it's so hard for us to think about this moment now and to analyze it, or even to compare it to other moments. Because, again, I digress, but there's this very famous interview with Alex in which he says, we did not know about the camps. Once we knew about the camps, everything changed. We know everything now. Everything is out there. Everything is open. Of course, there are different points of view and you can analyze things from different perspectives, but the information is there. You can count the dead in people. So I think, again, the question of recognition, the question of being able to face violence and to think about how you stand opposite it is the first step of understanding your position in the world. And in a way, maybe the soldier who was doing these heinous things to the buffaloes could actually be undergoing a process more easily than those who are looking away and sort of saying, well, someone's hitting a buffalo, it's none of my business, I don't have to deal with that. That's kind of, but it's a really, really interesting question, so I'm really, really grateful.
Yes, we do. I'd like to, if I understood your talk correctly, you have differentiated between the intellectual history behind your thinking, which is primarily based on Rosa Luxemburg, although you've taken Arendt into account. On the other hand, the other side of your talk has dealt with your personal writing as a Jewish woman today. This is part of the talk. You have not mentioned, unless I missed it, but I don't think you've mentioned other women or other people who have been writing about what's going on today. There are groups where they're taking witness statements, both in writing, both in oral history, and all sorts of. You haven't positioned yourself within the Israeli society amongst other activists, as you call yourself. Besides, you haven't mentioned in any shape or form the demonstrations against the Israeli government and what has been going on in Gaza or what's been going on in Lebanon. So I think you have removed yourself from what is actually going on in Israel today about what's going on with the war, both in Gaza and in Lebanon and on the West Bank. And I think that is an omission, considering you make yourself stand with activists. You can't only stand with Rosa Luxemburg. You have promised us that you will be talking about writing about your life today, and you haven't mentioned that.
Okay, I will respond to that. Thank you. So I'll start with the second part of the question and then I'll go to the first. It is true that there are very large demonstrations taking place against the government and have been every week for the past 2 years. I will say
2 years?
At least 2 years.
Yes, you have to differentiate again between before October the 7th and after October the 7th, which are hugely different. One is against the government itself before the war started, and against the war since October the 7th.
So that's my distinction, which is an important one. The demonstrations that we see every week are not anti-war demonstrations. They are anti-Netanyahu and they call for return of the hostages, sometimes not talking even of a hostage deal. Now they are more explicitly about the hostage deal, but at first they were very much bring them back. And there are also many campaigns saying bring them back and let's go back to Gaza the following day. The anti-war protest in Israel is, sadly for me to say, very, very small, incredibly small. I am very proud to be part of it. I have dear comrades who influence my thinking and writing, and I can name them here, although I think, again, my statement was always about my personal experience. This is a very personal book. It's a diary of my own place within the society. And also, I don't want to read words into other people's experiences, because I think one thing I've realized since October 7th is that we all experience in very different ways, including people who work very closely. The anti-war and the pro-Palestinian movement in Israel is tiny,
The
very
left
small.
is tiny, the left has almost
But
disappeared.
even within the left, again,
Yeah.
I did speak for instance
So
about
it's making it up for you to comment. It
Yeah, no, that's
it
great.
wasn't a judgment.
that's really helpful, but I'm sort of saying when I look at historical moments and I look at anti-war movements, it really makes me disheartened to see how small this movement is within Israel. Because there are equivalents. I mean, there was the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. There was an anti-war movement to which various people belonged in various stages of different wars. And we are a very tiny minority, especially, I have to say, Jewish Israelis, because again, once you start talking about Israel, I have many dear Palestinian comrades within Israel. They're afraid to be part of this movement because they will be prosecuted, because they will be seen as traitors if they dare to say something about Gaza. We have people we know who lost tens of family in Gaza and are not feeling welcome to speak about it because the Gazans are the enemy and they should be killed and wiped out. So if you grieve for your family, you're considered part of the enemy. Jewish Israelis who oppose the war are really important in this moment. And again, I'm really, really proud to be part of that community. And I'm proud, especially, I want to thank you, Illyria, for also speaking about my so-called day job, although it's a really big part of my life. 972 and Local Call, which is a nucleus of people who do that, who write and campaign and are part of this movement. But I also think that it's problematic to represent something that isn't there. So very often I see in foreign press, for instance, the very big demonstrations that are about the hostages against Netanyahu, but they're not about the war. They're often very militaristic. They're about people saying, let the army win, let the army do what it
I
needs to
have
do.
seen demonstrations on television. I haven't been in Israel in the last year,
I-
which asked for peace and a peace treaty.
I have been in most of these demonstrations. I've been going most Saturdays. They're mostly on Saturdays, and I'm there. And again, I would love for it to
Can
be
you
bigger.
comment why
Why?
I see why there are and how small are those demonstrations asking for a peace treaty, asking for peace?
Not more than 200 people at the best days,
Why is the Western media bringing those images?
because the Western media wants to galvanize something that is it's important. I mean, again, it's important that these voices are heard. I'm not saying that we shouldn't give platform to the few voices that are saying that. I think it's also Israeli society is really complicated. We have a lot of differences. Some things we can widely agree on. I think one thing that we're all realizing after October the 7th is that there's very little at this point that we can agree on, including in fairly small political camps. There have been huge breaks within people who see themselves as what they call the disillusion. These are people who call themselves lefties, but after the 7th say, look, these are enemies, we can't deal with them, we should negotiate with them, we can't trust them. These are some of our closest friends and comrades. This is not something like far away, the far right, the fascists that were fighting on the streets or something like that. On the other hand, what I've termed in my talk as the sort of soft left or Zionist left, who are fairly nationalistic, very militaristic, very often are led by generals of various kinds, retired generals. So there's one after the other. If you look at the history of the leaders of, for instance, the Labour Party or such parties, it's always kind of a retired general who takes the mantle of being the new hope for peace, but while talking in a very militaristic language. So again, I'm thinking about where is the scope of resistance to militarism in its own right? Where is the scope for resistance to colonialism? It doesn't come from these voices. It might be, and again, I don't think, and one thing that living with Rosa Luxemburg for 10 years has taught me, she has one quote that I think is wonderful, and she says, the masses are always where they need to be. You can't go to like 100,000 people and say, you're all wrong. And I think that's one thing that the left internationally is losing many battles by doing that. They're coming and saying, you've got it wrong. We need to work with what we have, and that's why, for instance, the small anti-war bloc has been going every week to these demonstrations, standing with anti-war signs, sometimes being, by the way, attacked by the non-anti-war bloc, but it is part of that demonstration and has been solidly since October 7th. I spoke at the first official legal anti-war demonstration, which was in November. It was very small and it had a lot of violence around it. It wasn't something that you could say to the world, Israelis now want peace. Israelis don't want peace. Israelis, first of all, don't know what they want because they have no alternative political vision. That's why I chose to end with Alan so talking about where we're going from here. I don't think any of us know where we can go from here. But I think in order to move from where we are, and actually this ties nicely back to my comment to the previous question, we need to be able to look at what's happening. And I think one of the largest problems right now in Israeli society is that we are actively choosing to look away. There is an active attempt to not engage. There's very little engagement with what's happening in Gaza. I would say that any person sitting in this room knows much better than an average parallel group in Israel what has actually happened in Gaza in the past year. And again, not for lack of access. CNN, BBC, everything is available online. My own outlet, 972, has 5 freelance writers who have been reporting from Gaza daily, 3 of whom we helped leave. But that all of this is available online. And my other outlet I work for, local call, has translated all of these reports into Hebrew. It's all available online. And yet people don't want to engage. So again, in order to move ahead from where we are, which I think is a stalemate in many ways, we need to be able to engage with reality as it is. Yes.
So thank you very much for that. It's really excellent combination of thoughts about life writing and about activism. I'm currently wondering whether I should write a book about Martyr Sen, who's been both an academic and in some ways an activist. He's also been a sort of a development scholar, an economist, and it's national course of gender equity. So there are lots of things going around in my head, and I'm just going to throw out one or two very briefly, in case you've got any prompting response. Just briefly on Rosa Luxemburg, I think what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting to me about her is you made a comment about her saying, referring to capitalism encroaching on other, and you mentioned physical resources, but actually now that game is over, and it's encroaching on the resources of our time and attention through all the digital technologies. So I think that point that you made is very pertinent and resonant. It just needs a small tweak, and it becomes central to some of the things we're experiencing today. Other words that came to mind as you were talking include things like prevention and backlash and burnout. Now I wonder, you allowed yourself a moment of lightness. You said engaging with a life was a bit like going on a blind date. But actually a lot of it's really quite heavy, isn't it? And so how do you deal with that? How do people deal with that? How, when we're writing about these things, do we deal with backlash and diversity? So, if we're all sensitive, particularly left-leaning, people have different nuances and different takes on things, and that sometimes gets in the way of consensus and direction. And then my final question or thought really is about prevention. So how do we link all of this stuff, all of this anger and resistance and want to change things for the best? How do we link it to action? And we talked about wanting to record and remember, and of course that's absolutely essential. But changing things, I've worked in the area of well-being in the past sort of 20 plus years, and there was a moment when it was really interesting, but interesting to wait, disappointing. And so what's left, and how, so that's
Thank you. It's incredibly rich. First of all, please write the book, because we need the new biography of him. I can still up teaching him my old days, PP. So much in there. I'll try and remember everything. Tell me if I forgot anything. I'm going to start by attention and capitalism. That's super interesting, and I think there is something, again, not being anachronistic and not seeing like Rosa Luxemburg looking into the future, she could see things, but I think there's something about the way in which she writes about how capitalism takes its toll on our humanity, on how we look at the world, on how we can access the world, and how we can engage with the world. That feels very prophetic. And I wrote a short piece on neoliberalism and Luxemburg, and I think there's a lot in what she says that you can kind of take and look at sort of very contemporary texts and see how she really resonates with that. She had an extraordinary attention span. I mean, incredibly rich. Even, and I will say in parenthesis that in her own canon, there's been a lot of developments. We now know that she suffered very much from depression, especially when she was in prison. And a lot of what was read is like the romantic third love, that she was actually in really dark places, and probably had she had access to treatment today, she would have fared much better. But she also at the same time had this capacity to write through it all and to sort of understand the world, and even in her darkest moment. And again, I think it's interesting, the other letter on the Buffalo that I actually found very recently, where she says, does it help anyone that I look into the Buffalo's eyes? How does it help in sort of working towards a better world? So she was able to do this self-reflection on herself, which I think is pretty extraordinary. So that's incredibly helpful and interesting. But talk a little bit about having a relationship as a biographer with a person. I think it can be really heavy. You can never really escape it. I think she's very much present. It's interesting because I just sent the translation to my editor a few weeks ago. And I feel she's less there, but then it was weird because then I had this moment with the 15 Calvin. I was like, no, she's still very present. And I will say in parentheses, I'm really lucky my partner is here today, who's been kind of holding my hand very much in the process of this, in this writing process. She's a brilliant international law professor, so any questions about genocide, please ask her. I leave that in the household. And I'm also indebted to her for the citation on Allied and Spartans for that. But I think she can also testify, when I write about, for instance, the murder, and when I write about the violence towards the murder, I find it's really hard to disconnect from that. And when I wrote the book, I remember I wrote part about Luxemburg's murder in one night and with a lot of wine, and I just felt I need to get it out of me, and I knew how to do it. I just got it out of me. I sent it to my mother, and my mother, who's not a very sentimental woman, said, I cried, and I was like, okay, I got it right. And then I got to look at it again. Sorry, Mom. And when I translated it, I still sat and found myself weeping through it. And again, it is something I know intellectually, and I've been working in the archives in various capacities for years and years. And still, when you sit with that moment, when she's alone with the flight box, and in a way you witness this horrific moment. And it's your obligation to report, but also you kind of want to intervene, but you can't because it's 1919. So again, all these things that are happening together. And I think writing a biography is a very lonely project. You need to be aware of that when you start. I think every writing project can be lonely, but a biography, especially because it is a relationship with a person, and it's just you and them for that duration. Being in conversation with other people who support you is helpful. Reading about other people, engaging with the person. I have to say I'm really very lucky because I'm also part of the Complete Works editorial board, Rosa Luxemburg Complete Works editorial board. And it's a community of Luxembourg scholars who are very, very committed to her and are very supportive of each other. So, if I'm going into a new project on her, I very often will shoot the line to some people who I work with, and they'll be like, oh, how can I support you in that? So that's really very helpful. Yes, sorry.
I've meant to ask you before, where is the main archive, or where are the archives?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll just finish what I would say about action, and then I'll talk about
because
archives.
you said you're belonging to a group of, so I was wondering.
So, all right, archives. Yes, and if we start talking about archives, it might take a while. So how do we translate all this into action or prevention? I think that's the big question, and I don't have answers. And I think for me, trying to think through this distinction, which is fairly new, again, I've been writing about it for not more than a couple of months, between internal resistance and external resistance, and what might be these landscapes of internal resistance, and why might they be valuable? Because I think, again, and this kind of also harks back to the previous question about external protest, where it is and where it is, and what do we do when it is there? Well, what do? We don't have these large collectors we can go and say, I'm part of that and I can galvanize that. But also not just keeping to internal dialogue, because I think it, first of all, it's very lonely. Just be sitting with yourself and thinking, oh my God, this is terrible. It doesn't help yourself, it doesn't help anyone around you. But there are acts you can do in the world that, to me, writing is one of them. That is, can be a small intervention. It could affect a person, two people, something around you. And that to me is part of this moment of internal resistance. I think I've become over the past year more hesitant to say that writing is an act of intervention in the world, just because everything that has been happening around me has been so terrible. And again, I think it's interesting to reflect and say that many people around me, we have the intellectual analysis. I can say exactly why everything that had happened the way that it did, including, by the way, things that are really hurtful and problematic for me personally. As I said, I have family in the South, many of whom have been displaced, many of whom were under fire. It was a horrific, the 7th of October was a horrific day. I understand politically completely why it happened. I mean, these two things can coexist. So to come from, I can analyze something to I can cultivate it into a moment of writing that can change the world, I think is an arc that I no longer support. Maybe I thought that way a couple of years ago. I do not think that way now. I do think, again, being part of a collective of writers, being part of a community of people who believe that the word can influence how people think. And again, just to feel less lonely in these moments of saying, I can look at what's happening around me and I think it's wrong. So it's not just me looking at what's happening around me and thinking that's wrong. That could be the first step. But again, I think I've become more, I don't want to say cynical because I'm not a cynical person, but I do think I've become more hesitant to say writing can change the world in a way that maybe I would have said in a talk like this 2 years ago. Archives, Luxembourg archives, really complicated. So there's been a lot of tampering in her archive after her murder, both by her own party, the SPD, that wanted to cover up a lot of the collaborations with the Freikorps that actually led to her murder, and then with certain views. So they, on the one hand, they wanted to canonize her and to make her kind of a martyr, which, by the way, she explicitly wrote against. She kind of saw where things were heading. She also, by the way, knew she was going to be murdered, part of the darkness of living with her in her past, in her last month. She actually writes and says that coming after me, I have to run away every night. I'm sleeping in a different place. So you really are like with her until the very last moments. There was an attempt to make her a martyr. And then obviously, if you think about the first few decades after her murder, we're talking about the Cold War, we're talking about the positioning of communism as a very specific thing in the world. Actually, this ties nicely to the question about Arendt and Luxembourg reception. Because when Arendt looks at Luxembourg, it's absolutely through the lens of the Cold War and how Luxembourg is read within the Stalinist canon and this kind of engagement. There is a rich body of work that is only now being discovered. So Luxembourg spoke many languages. She translated a lot of texts. Some of her writing in German is generally most known and has been made accessible fairly promptly after her murder and translated into various languages. I'm getting to it. So, but a lot of it has been published very recently after she was murdered. A lot of her writing, for instance, in Polish, have been recently discovered. So there is a project of the collected works in German, which is massive. It includes some translations, but not all. That has been published in the 80s, some in the 90s. There is now a project of the collected works of Rosa Luxemburg that is published by Verso. I'm part of the editorial board. We keep finding new texts. The text can transpire in various other archives because the way that archives work is that sometimes you discover a text that Luxemburg wrote to Edward Bernstein, and some lucky Bernstein scholar will find it and send it to us. There is a large archive in the International Institute of Social History, where I wrote some of my book. That's in Amsterdam, and that's a large archive that includes all the Second International papers. And one reason that it's now accessible is that a lot of the papers were sent after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. There was an exchange. These were papers that were held in Moscow for many, many years, then sent to Amsterdam and are now, by the way, if you go on the website of the International Institute of Social History, a lot of it is available online. So you can just go and scroll to your heart's desire, and it's completely open to the public. In the wonderful Dutch way, you can just walk in and say, I would like to say to see the Rosa Luxemburg papers, and they will arrive on your desk. So there's not one place that are the Rosa Luxemburg archives. They are also in the nature of her work. She was an internationalist. Her papers are kind of everywhere. And I have to say, part of what I also did in the book, and I'm really interested constantly, is she is read so widely and so richly around the world. She's read in the Near East, she's read in the Far East, she's read in India, she's read in South America, she's read everywhere. I mean, one of my colleagues just went to give a talk in South Korea about her. She is really read internationally, and her archives are kind of also dispersed internationally. So it's very rich world, and it's also surprisingly exciting because we still keep finding new texts. I mean, every so often I'll get an email from the complete edition, someone saying, hey, we just found this thing that she wrote in 1912 and no one knew about, and it was discovered in some letter that she wrote to someone, and someone found by accident in a different archive. So it's quite extraordinary, and it's, again, it's very much alive. It makes our community very much alive. Yes, Rosa.
If you're finished.
Yeah.
Just firstly, thank you so much for your talk. I found it really, really great. It was so raw and it was very touching. And you mentioned that writing for you at this moment is a form of internal resistance. And I just wanted to ask you a bit more about how it actually feels and whether you feel any fear of being such a critical voice at the moment, particularly because it's new work will kind of be questioning the legitimacy of the Zionist project itself, possibly kind of you're wanting to follow Arendt's work and question whether or not the Jewish ethnic state was the right idea. And of course, many people in Israel have faced criticism for holding these kinds of views. And famously, Ilan Pappé, who has exited Israel for kind of related concerns. So just on a personal level, how does it feel being so critical? Do you have any fear knowing that you are part of such a small minority who are so critical in this way? How do you deal with that?
Thank you. That's an incredibly generous question. I don't think fear is the right word. I think, first of all, I am part of a very warm community. There's not many of us, but we are kind to each other. Both in my day job and in my personal life and people around me. People do have resistance and can respond very angrily to some things I write about, and even the sort of things that I kind of go and say to the world. I think for us, and something that we talk about a lot, we keep also reminding ourselves that we're not the victim, because it's very easy. Sometimes the attacks are vicious, and especially when it comes to people close to us, it is very hard to deal with that. It does happen a lot. It happens in the family, it happens with close friends. It's like a lot of people, when I respond to an earlier question, there are a lot of people who thought we're more like-minded, but suddenly we're like, no, this is a very different person to who I thought you were. But in the grander scheme of things and how we see the world right now, we are not the victims. I feel that one thing that has always motivated me is that I feel I'm really privileged and I have a lot of securities and things that keep me safe. And critique can be unpleasant, but it's not life-threatening at this point. I think a lot of us have no illusions that things can escalate quickly, and we know that the legislation can be passed. We talk about that in my place of work. We talk about in many places that the difference between being able to write and still, get hateful comments on Twitter or Facebook to being prosecuted in real life. And to be fair, also it has happened to several of my colleagues who have been prosecuted in real life, which is incredibly frightening. We're still not there. When we will be there, I will look at my options, and I don't think many of us who choose to do this work and coming back to Israel Palestine and choosing to do what I do now was a decision. It's really weird to be back at Oxford. I had a wonderful time here. It's a home to me in many ways. It's an intellectual home. It's for me, that's why being here is so significant, because it is returning to where I started thinking about a lot of these questions. But I also feel that my heart is elsewhere and my home is elsewhere. And it can only be my home when it is just, and when I feel that it's a place that I don't have to be so deeply ashamed of. I am feeling right now. So yeah, it can be heavy. I think writing this book was really weird. I really didn't want to write the book. The book was it started as blogs, and then it became this collection. And I was very hesitant. I was kind of discussing with colleagues and saying, should I publish it? And I felt very uneasy. And when it was published, I kind of I didn't want to do a book launch because I said, how can you do a book launch for something so dark? But then I was convinced to do a book launch and it was really interesting. So it's kind of like a process of coming to terms that it has some significance in the world for some people, and that could be the very small thing that I'm doing right now. Again, because I feel so helpless against the very large things I'm going to do. So, yeah.
Maybe not an appropriate question considering we're listening to, or we're trying to listen to Jewish women's voices. Why have they not mentioned how elitist? They had
I mentioned him a lot in the book.
I'm sure you have, but have you kept him out of this conversation because we are concentrating on women?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I want to ask you a question. You know, could almost be seen as frivolous as a sort of thank goodness, which is actually about the importance of dance, actually. And because you very deliberately put, actually, first of all, that you're a dancer. And so, and I want to take, I take dance very, very seriously. And I think I just want to put that in the space, if you like, the seriousness of not simply the intellectual work, of course, but what it means to be embodied in this time and to actually embrace that. And it makes me think of that phrase, I can't remember it in Spanish, but it goes something like, that they cannot take away from us that we dance.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know that it exists in Spanish. I knew that there are various iterations of that. Thank you. That's again a very generous question. I think for myself, dance is part of who I am, part of my habitus. It's also part of what I've been doing to sort of survive this year. Yeah, it's also very much in the book and in the blogs. Since the studios were open, when it became safe enough, according to the army and the government officials, I returned to the studio, and it's felt like I have a very strong community in the dance world in Israel. And I think for me, it's part of being an embodied person in the world. It's part of dealing with the world through my body. It's also such a big part of who I am that it's like when I'm asked to send a bio, it's always like part of how I see myself. I think for my fellow dance artists and people in the dance community, they've been feeling about their art the way that I feel about writing. That on the one hand, it's incredibly important to us right now, and I was writing really out of instinct and almost without editing myself, the blogs especially. But also we understand the limits of what it can make, the change it can make in the world. So, I wrote a whole book about dance as activism. I think a lot of my dancer friends are kind of, yes, we want to use dance as activism, but we also understand its limits at this moment in time. So I think, for me, dance is part of being in the world, it's part of dealing with the world, it's part of being able to look at the world. And it's never disengaged from other things that I'm doing. I'm saying, hey, when I wanted a deadline, I would still go to dance class when it's something that is such a big part of my life. But I'm also aware of its limits and of what it can't achieve. And I think, for us right now, it is kind of dark moment to keep questioning what is the position of our vocations, respectively, in this moment in time.
I'm afraid we've had to wrap it up there. And so it's wonderful to have you speak so eloquently and beautifully and about such difficult topics. The questions that we've had today have been incredible and so interesting. So thank you so much for coming and engaging so thoughtfully. I really hope that we see you at our future events. But for now, thank you very much, Dana. Thank you for having us.